Are you ready to go beyond pen test reporting? Elevate your offensive security and measure risk reduction by streamlining pen test planning, report creation, and findings delivery. Request and attend a one-on-one personalized demo today at securityweekly.com/PlexTrack, and PlexTrack will send you a Starbucks $10, Euro, or Pounds gift card totally free just for your time. That's securityweekly.com/PlexTrack. When it comes to ensuring your company has top-notch security practices, things can get complicated and time-consuming fast. Now you can assess risk, secure the trust of your customers, and automate compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, HIPAA, and more with a single platform, Vanta. Vanta's leading trust management platform helps you automate evidence collection, unify risk management, and streamline security reviews. Save hours of work by completing security questionnaires with Vanta AI. Go to securityweekly.com/Vanta to watch their on-demand demo. That's securityweekly.com/VANTA. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Make sure you join our community on Discord. Connect directly with expert hosts, join discussions with fellow audience members, and customize your notifications to receive alerts every time an episode of your favorite show gets published. You can get your invite at securityweekly.com/Discord. Sam Bound has joined us. Sam, welcome.
Good evening. Glad to be here.
Mr. Lee Neely is here.
Hey, and ready as always to have some fun.
Sweet. Me too. We also have a special guest for this segment, Bianca Lewis. Or I'm going to call you Bia. Is that okay if I call you Bia? Is that cool?
Totally cool with that.
Okay. Bia is a 17-year-old hacker and maker and the founder and CEO of Girls Who Hack, a nonprofit teaching middle school and high school girls the skills of hacking so that they can change the future. She also started Secure Open Vote, her own end to an election system that is completely open source. And you were the DEF CON goon in charge of DCNextGen, which previously was DEF CON Kids, but is now called DCNextGen. Bia, welcome to the show. Welcome back, I should say.
Hello. Yes, it's been a while.
Yes, it's nice to have you, Bia, on the show. I guess I want to start with, first, I applaud your efforts to stay in this field and continue to be an evangelist to get people in this field of cybersecurity. But I want to learn a little bit about the kind of the next generation of the DEF CON Next Gen group.
Oh, goodness. Okay, so if you've been to DEF CON for a while, you know there used to be the Roots Asylum, which was the kids' con within DEF CON. And then when COVID came, that died for a ton of reasons. A lot of drama behind that. I don't even know the full story. But last year at DEF CON, they brought a similar thing back with DEF CON Kids, which they didn't really talk about or make a big thing, since it was sort of like a soft launch to see, okay, are parents like interested to bring their kids to DEF CON? Is this going to be a thing? And I was a goon for DEF CON Kids then. And I was one of the few goons because it was a smaller thing. At the end of DEF CON, during the goon party, which is completely iconic, I straight up asked them, like, okay, can I run this next year? And they're like, you know what? Sure. And being a kid myself, at least for one more year, cries in almost 18, I'm excited to sort of bring a young perspective to this whole thing and try it out. So the overall plan is already in action, and we've done so much to prepare for it. Our main goal is to keep this for kids and teens, because usually kids' content is just kid stuff, hence why we also changed the name. So we're going to have a bunch of CTFs that we're already doing, some Jeopardy style. I also have someone building like a physical machine where you have to like move wires and do things like that. And there's going to be a ton of prizes as well, which is going to be really exciting. We have a badge already that is like in manufacturing. It's being designed. The prototype is already done and it's working. It's amazing. I wish I could show it, and I am going to soft launch it soon.
No. So Bia, who designed the badge for DCNextGen?
Me and how do I say his name? Brandon, it has the little accent mark, but he's designed a ton of other like iconic DEF CON like group and village badges, as well as community badges, and I got to
Nice.
see like little sneak peeks of some of them from this year.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about the hardware, or we just gotta wait and see?
I'm not gonna say too much. I'm not gonna say too much.
However much you want to disclose. I'm curious because I love badges. I love electronics and hardware hacking, so it intrigues me.
Okay, definitely. I wanted it to be something rather than just a piece of plastic that says DCNextGen. I wanted something that the kids can actually use and learn and continue to use outside of DEF CON. So it has RGB NeoPixel LEDs, of course, that you can program with CircuitPython along with speakers, touch sensors as well to go with the speaker. And I don't want to reveal this part just yet, but
don't give away too much.
It looks really cool, even when it's not being used, which will make sense when I post about it.
Yeah, no, that can be tricky for a badge. I mean, it can just look like a circuit board, but to look cool when it's not powered on is a feat for sure.
Exactly, and every single one is unique, which is awesome too, because now everyone's got their own thing. It also has a full case around it, because I don't know if you remember the drama with Roots a while ago where they had badges catching on fire since they were like touching other badges and stuff, and we're like, we don't want a lawsuit, so we're just gonna avoid this for now. We also have our own like area, so we're hosting classes that go along with the badge, like intro to Python sort of stuff, some more intro base level, like intro to hacking courses and building a virtual machine, those kind of basic things as well, throughout the days. As for talks, we're not sure if we're going to host talks yet, but I'm going to open up a call for papers, and I want kids to do the talks rather than adults, so that they have an easier chance and a good platform to talk about what they're working on.
Sorry, Bia, when you say kids, what's the in your opinion, what's the age range for those of us that like have kids that may or may not have expressed interest into coming to DEF CON with their parents? What's the age range that you're targeting?
Honestly, I would say any, but if to like fully enjoy the content that I have created, anywhere between, like, if your kid knows how to use a computer and a mouse generally, so I'd say like 10, 11, all the way through 18, because that's when you're an adult, that's DEF CON Kids content. Like I said, all the CTFs and all the training and classes and things start off more beginner level so that the noobs or the younger kids can work and learn, and then it starts getting more technical, and a bunch of the flags of the CTF are harder for more advanced kids who are doing this a ton like me. So that's going to be cool.
Yeah, so like general rule of thumb, because I mean, as you know, Bia, like kids, they progress at different ages, but like roughly 10 years old, you should start considering.
Roughly 10 years old. Younger, we're also going to host like fun parties and more quote unquote kidsy stuff as well. So if you have young ones that you don't want to leave at home, you can bring them too, and we'll have stuff for them. But to truly enjoy all the content, I'd say 10 and up for sure.
Okay. No, that's good. I love the badge stuff and the intro to Python, because I think that's I love that we're in a place today, technology wise, where there's so much hardware accessible to folks that can be programmed with something like Python, that they can get like not instant gratification, but get like tactile feedback, right? Like you can take some electronics, a little bit of Python, you can make some lights blink. Like that's a great thing for kids.
Definitely, and especially with what?
I said easy win. It's not impossible.
Oh, most definitely.
Yeah, it's not daunting,
like an
right?
actual physical board, the kids can, and I say kids, but I also mean kids/teens. I still see myself as a kid, so they can see their work physically, like I did something on the computer and it did something to something outside. Because usually if you do something on a machine, you're like, at least for kids when I was younger, I'm like, okay, so it did something. But this, you can actually physically see what you did, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's funny, Bia. I wanted to ask you about this. My kids are super involved with soccer, right? And so we get involved with families that have multiple kids, and a few of them will be like, what do you do? Like, what is that Flipper Zero thing you have? And I'm like, well, here. I'm like, go take this. And I'm like, go program it, turn it on off your TV. And they're like, no, I can do that. And I'm like, yeah. I'm like, go here and like do this. And then the TV turns on and off, and the look on their face is like, oh my God, that was amazing. And I'm like, I want to teach everyone how to do that, because the enjoyment I get out of seeing the look on their face where they just did something on like a computer-based device that affected something in the real world. They're like, oh, I didn't know that was possible, right? And I feel like that's what DCNextGen is somewhat enabling, right? Is that kids can realize like, wow, this stuff is really cool.
Oh, most definitely. I want to keep it sort of incorporating actual DEF CON into it, because Roots was like its own separate thing, its own entity where parents would just bring their kids, sometimes even leave their kids, and have it almost be a conference within a conference. But I want parents and kids to work together and learn at DEF CON together, rather than just on their own and have it be separate. So that's why I'm having a ton of different villages have kids content within their own thing. I mean, last year, the SE village had a entire CTF for the kids where they had to go all around the entire conference to a bunch of other villages and do things. So I'm going to have the different villages have content for lower level, like 10 to 14, whatever, and then like 14 to 17 have more technical content as well in each one of the villages. I mean, when I first went to DEF CON when I was like 11 or something, the coolest part was getting to experience it with my dad and sort of see like, oh, so this is what dad does for work. This actually kind of makes sense now, and it's pretty cool. So instead of just keeping DCNextGen as its own entity, I want it to be a part of DEF CON.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. My gears are turning. Like my own kids have said stuff over the years of like, I didn't like when you have a kid, they're like, oh, well, like dad's not cool. But then, they look at like, oh, what's dad doing? I'm like, I don't know. I'm like able to do this and that other thing with my whatever device it is. And they're like, well, that's really cool, Dad. Like, you going to Vegas this year? Like, what happens at Vegas? I'm like, well, we all get together and we share ideas about like hacking stuff. And they're like, oh, I want to go. Like, this is a great way for kids to get involved with what their parents do. Is kind of what I'm hearing, Bia.
Oh, most definitely. And one of the biggest things and biggest questions I get from parents who want to bring their kids to DEF CON is it safe? Like, is DEF CON safe? Which now so even more than ever, because like at the start of DEF CON, from stories I've heard at least, because I wasn't here since the start of DEF CON, it was beyond wild. And I know DEF CON can have quite the nightlife, but with all the goons, with all the management, and with just good-hearted people making sure that there aren't bad people around, yes, it's definitely safe. Yes, you should bring them. Don't be too freaked out like, it's a bunch of hackers. Yes, it's a bunch of hackers, but most of them are amazing people. So
no, I'll back that up. I've been in the hacker conference scene and cybersecurity for a long time. Let's say I would back that up 100%. Right. I'd also say that I follow like what happens in Vegas in terms of like what's happening in Vegas for families and kids, and I think it's more so going in that direction. I've been going to Vegas countless numbers of times, not just for DEF CON, but other security conferences as well. And I think it's definitely leaning towards a more family-oriented place. I follow certain social media accounts. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that existed in Vegas, to the point where like my family's like, I tell them these things and they're like, oh, I want to go to Vegas. Like that sounds like fun. So not only is the hacker community very welcoming of kids and families, but I think Vegas is as well. I don't know if you follow that at all, Bia, but I'll like put my stake in the ground and say it's more family oriented than years past.
Definitely, because I've gone to DEF CON basically every single year since I was 11, which was like 6 years ago.
Yep.
And I've noticed the change, and I love it.
Yeah, it's great. So what else is happening at DCNextGen for kids? Like, how do people, if you're sitting there right now and you're listening, we've already convinced you, like, oh, this is a place I want to take my kids. Like, how do you register? How do we get people involved?
Okay, to register, there's no like official register that you need to sign a form or whatever. You just kind of need to show up during the actual orientation day, where I'll give a full talk rundown of, okay, this is everything we have for you to do. Go nuts. Obviously, scheduling will come out as to when all the get-together parties are and when the workshops are and what sort of age demographic the workshops are for.
Wait,
and those
does everyone need a DEF CON badge to attend?
Everyone needs a DEF CON badge, even
Okay.
if you're a kid. I think the only exception is like infants, and that is it.
Gotcha.
But yeah, you're going to need a DEF CON badge. As for the DCNextGen badge, you just get one of those in a swag bag with like a ton of other cool stuff. So that's exciting.
So is there a separate registration for DCNextGen, or you got to show up and it's first come, first serve?
Nope. You just show up, and if you don't come to like the orientation or whatever, and you didn't grab your badge then you can just get it from our area and ask one of the DCNextGen goons for a badge. And the other cool stuff that we have planned. And DCNextGen will be going on throughout the entirety of DEF CON. It's not just like a one-day sort of event.
And so where is it within DEF CON?
So as you probably know, DEF CON switched spaces kind of recently.
Yes, we heard that it was canceled and then it was uncanceled. Yep, we heard about that.
Yep, and that whole thing. So we originally had a different space. Now we have a new space, but they're not sure if that's our space because they can't decide where to put everything. So once it's organized, we'll know. I don't even know, so I can't even tell you yet.
No worries. We'll try and mention that on the show once we send us a note. Once it's figured out, we'll make sure we mention it on the show.
Okay, awesome. I also have the DCNextGen site up. That's DCNextGen.com. And let's just say the website is in simple HTML on purpose. Okay. That's all I'm going to say about that.
No,
we
works.
also have social media starting up where I'm going to post more information, and you can reach out if you have any questions about anything regarding DCNextGen. It's DC, like the letters DC. It's DEF CON. Sorry, not DC. It's DEF CON Next Gen, no spaces, on let's see, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Mastodon, the entirety of the social media gods.
Gotcha.
So you can see all updates, all contents when I start, leaking little photos of the badge and how that's going and other cool things like that up until the actual day of the event.
That's awesome. Yeah, I can see a lot. I think a lot of folks are like me, kind of on the fence. Like, do I bring my kids? Do I not bring my kids? And this is a big reason why you should bring your kids, to DEF CON with you, I think.
Most definitely. And even if you don't have kids, you can always kidnap one and bring it. Just kidding.
You planned that. You've been waiting to say that for a while, haven't you?
Hey, listen, I have made the joke before, but never like on a podcast or something. So I saw the opportunity and I took it. But if you don't have kids and you still want to help out in any way whatsoever, you can just reach out to any of the socials, because I'm chronically online and I'm running it. So I'll see it for sure, and I'll see what you can do.
Bia, I have a question that I want to ask you, because I think you bring an interesting perspective to it, and that is, we've been talking about the Flipper Zero for a long time, and all things Flipper Zero, right, for well over a year. And what is your take on the Flipper Zero and how it can help kids get interested in hacking? Is it a positive thing? Is it not a positive thing? What's your take on it?
It is most definitely a positive thing. When I first got mine, I just immediately started playing around with it. And when I was at the airport pretty recently with my dad, he's like, "Shh, don't tell anyone." And he pulls out the Flipper Zero and he's like, "You want to turn off all the TVs here?" And I'm like, I don't want to get kicked out before our flight, dude.
Right.
That's not a fun idea. But there's so many opportunities to do physical things with it, like we talked about earlier, that kids can actually visually see, like, hacking in action, especially since it has the more graphic game style towards the actual UI itself,
Yeah, I look at it as an overwhelmingly positive thing for kids, especially to get into hacking, to have that aha moment of like, oh, I can take advantage or change things in the physical world with this device, right? But it's also an opportunity to have the conversation with kids, as you already kind of alluded to, Bia, of like, well, we need to act with ethics and morals and values as well. Right. So I try and, my kids are like, "Oh, Dad, what are you gonna do this and that with the Flipper Zero?" I'm like, "No, like, I don't have permission and there's no reason for me to do that." Right. And in other circumstances, I'm like, they're like, why are you trying to turn off that TV? I'm like, I just want to see if it works at that range, to be quite honest. We were on vacation. It was kind of funny, right? At a ski resort. And I was using my Flipper Zero trying to turn off a TV. And they're like, "Dad, why you do that?" I'm like, really, I just want to see if I can do that from this distance, right? Like, I don't think it's going to work, but I just want to see if I can. And by the way, if I can turn it off, I'll turn it back on again, right? So I'll leave things as I found it. And I'm like, that's how you should be as a hacker. And they kind of get that kind of ethos built into them at an early age.
Oh, most definitely. With the whole ethics thing, the one, thing you always think of when someone says hackers, the guy in the hood, laptop in his basement, numbers going down the screen.
Yeah, I hate that persona. I hate that persona, by the way, Bia. I hate that.
I know.
We still haven't changed that. Like, you Google for hacker on image search, and that's what you see is the hooded figure with the dark colors and the whole thing. Yeah.
Yes. And kids these days still, I sound so old, kids these days. But kids these days still have this image in their mind because they always hear, if they hear about a hacker or something being hacked, what the older generations hear is things like this politician something. But what kids hear is like their favorite streamer got hacked or their Roblox account got hacked or something. So in their mind, the idea of a hacker is someone who's just trying to gain power, influence, information, money, et cetera, and then they have that bad notion. So when they hear dad and mom work in cybersecurity, they don't really understand that, that's hacking too,
Right.
But it's good hacking, and you can also work in this field and do that cool stuff that you see those bad guys doing, but in a good way.
I think DCNextGen is an opportunity to really, for us that have been working in cybersecurity for some time, to have an influence on the next generation, as I think you've aptly named it, right? And it's kind of funny. Being on the show, I described a scenario where my family and I were at one of the second largest mall in America. It's American Mall. It's in New Jersey, right? And we were at the Mr. Beast restaurant, and there was some younger kids, probably like 10, 11, 12-ish age, with the Flipper Zero trying to turn the TVs off. And I was like, "Hey, what are you doing trying to use your Flipper Zero and the IR modules and turn that off?" And they looked at me like, "What does this old guy know about Flipper Zeros?" And I was like, "Look, you should look at different firmware. They got a lot of, IR databases." I'm like, "But also you should use this in an ethical manner." And so this is me with two kids that had a Flipper Zero influencing them. And I'm like, we need to collectively as an industry, have this influence on so many more people than just one or two kids that Paul happened to run across in the mall, right? So, like, I want to put like a call to action to parents of kids that have an interest in hacking and technology to bring them to things like DCNextGen, where they can learn not just technology, but about hacking and be exposed to people like us that have been doing it for a long time that can also like explain the morals, ethics, and values of doing that.
With great power comes great responsibility.
For sure.
It's that whole talk, for sure.
Yeah. Well, it's awesome. I'm glad you're doing this. I was glad to see this continue and kind of morph and evolve into what it's going to be this year at DEF CON. So thank you for doing this, Bia.
And thank you for supporting the whole mission and everything and helping get the message out there, because I want to market this as much as I can to get as many kids into this as possible.
That's awesome. Well, certainly we'll be talking to all of our friends that have kids, and since we're old, many of our friends have kids that will encourage them to bring them to this event in this kind of subset of DEF CON. So awesome. Keep us updated, Bia.
Will do.
Anything else you want to share that people should know about DCNextGen?
I guess going off of what we kind of just talked about and we're talking about throughout the whole thing about showing kids like opportunities they have, because anytime I talk to some of my friends or their siblings who are younger or older or around this sort of age range, is they believe if you work in technology, you're either an engineer, a developer, programmer,
right.
But they don't know that you can actually, hack as a job and that there are endless jobs. I mean, I just keynoted at Cyber Launch in Florida, and there was almost 1,000 kids, and I looked through a bunch of red team, blue team, and purple team jobs, picked quite a few of them, and talked about every single one. And I had kids come up to me and be like, I did not even know those were jobs and that I could do that for work,
Yeah, no, that's a great kind of PSA, right, for folks that this is a job you can do, for sure. And quite frankly, we need folks to come into this field, so.
Yeah, and DCNextGen will give you that opportunity to see your options.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, Bia, thank you so much for coming back on Paul's Security Weekly.
Thank you so much for having me. It's fun as always.
Awesome. Keep us updated. Any information you need to give us, I'll make sure we evangelize on the show.
Perfect.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bia. With that, we're going to segue into the news. Sam, Lee, do you have stories that you want to start off with?
Well, sure. I was looking at this. I think the most important story, in my opinion, is Google's perspective on memory safety, which I saw you had too. And when I talked to students about this, they said, gee, I shouldn't learn C anymore. And I said, well, I wouldn't go that far. I mean, we're going to be stuck with C and C++ and C# for another decade, for sure, as we gradually transition to memory-safe languages. But they show that memory safety bugs are responsible for the majority of severe vulnerabilities. And Android 13 already has 1.5 million lines of Rust. And that Rust code has 0 memory safety vulnerabilities. So I think Rust and other memory safe languages are the future. And we'll spend the next decade gradually switching over from C and C++.
I think it's not feasible to think that we're going to rewrite every line of C and C++ in a memory-safe language, right?
No, of course. Nobody has the time to go back to the old stuff.
But let's say we did. We would still be presented with a number of different vulnerabilities that we would have to deal with. That doesn't...
Oh, sure. Or non-memory vulnerabilities. That's what you mean, sure.
We would still have to... no one's saying that we could rewrite software and have it be perfect, right?
Oh, no.
That's the rub for me, is that even the 1.5 million lines of Rust in Android today maybe have no known exploitable vulnerabilities, but who's to say that people look at it and go, oh, there are vulnerabilities in there. And they're maybe not traditional memory safety vulnerabilities. Maybe they're Rust-specific vulnerabilities. They're logic vulnerabilities. There are other vulnerabilities that don't speak to memory safety. Now, the thing that kind of backed me off on my stance, Sam, is that 70% of vulnerabilities are related to memory safety, right?
Right.
But it's still like a balance, right? Like, I think I'm on the camp of rewriting is potentially bad. Potentially bad.
No, I think rewriting would be good for security, but it's totally impractical because there's so much C out there. The only reasonable transition is to switch to writing new stuff in the new language. And you are right, however, I must say, Rust is fairly new.
Right. So
And
we don't know. We don't know, right? Like C was fairly new,
Yeah,
but like how many years do we need to go back?
yeah.
All of us older folks, Lee, Sam, myself, that are on the show now, right? We go back to early days of C and the vulnerabilities that we understood back then. Fast forward to today and all the history that has transpired since then about what we know about C vulnerabilities. There's a process, there's an understanding, there's an evolution that's happened in the understanding of vulnerabilities. To me, newer languages like Rust haven't gone through that evolution yet. So we could sit here and say, you're going to write more secure code in Rust, but like we really don't know what that looks like until you've got 30-year-old Rust code that has been running on these various systems.
Well, but you do
Again,
know how,
but it's a 30,000-foot view, Sam, right?
yeah, but you know how bad C has been. I mean, C has created so many generations of malware that I think it's a reasonable bet that Rust will be better.
True. I mean, we could relate this to any number of given tools, right, that have existed since the beginning of time. Like we could go, well, you know, Hammer had certain vulnerabilities, but then like a Hammer drill was a more automated version when iterations on various technologies, right? Like I don't know the analogies that exist there, but I still think rewriting code could just be that we're remaking the problems of the past in a different way.
I doubt it.
I mean, it remains to be seen, right? We won't know that until there's Rust code that's been sitting out there for 30 years that we go, hey, look, like in the past 30 years, like we really have no resource that has pushed the boundaries of how we exploit these particular vulnerabilities. Memory safety is one, albeit a very large, like, canvas of which we can paint on for vulnerabilities. However, it's not the only form of vulnerability.
Well, I mean, in theory, I think you're right, but in practice, when I'm writing Rust, it just seems like it's what C should have been all along. It extends variables. You really declare exactly what they should be, and then you get errors whenever you're putting the wrong kind of data in there, which is what C should have had.
But what if we go to languages like Java?
That's also memory safe. The only problem is it's not as fast as C.
Right, but we've seen a ton of deserialization vulnerabilities in Java are what plagued Java.
That's true. They've added that new feature of serialization. I wonder if Rust has added new features like that. There's these things called crates. I'm not quite sure what they are.
I want to say that I don't think necessarily, like we may end up ahead at the end of the day, but I also want to say that rewriting software may still introduce a number of vulnerabilities. It may be less than the vulnerabilities we had writing software in a non-memory safe language, but that doesn't necessarily wipe out any new vulnerabilities, right? Given time. Take an open source project that is 30 years in development. We've had a long time to flesh out bugs and vulnerabilities in that software, right? Rewriting that software in a new language that's memory safe may have benefits, but who knows what we'll introduce in terms of bugs and or vulnerabilities in that software if we rewrite it. And I think that's why a lot of projects are leaning towards not rewriting the entire project in something like Rust, but rewriting portions of it. And then seeing how that does over time. I think that's where we're at.
I think Lee had a good idea.
Well, I was thinking, if you get a wild hair, okay, I'm on a project and I want to redo it in Rust, and what have I gotten myself into? Because I've got to convert the whole thing. I can't just convert part of it. Well, I can convert a discrete executable, but I can't convert half of it. And I think Sam had an idea. He suggested you could write a Rust converter that would take C++ and turn it into Rust. And I thought, if you could do that, that would be awesome. Yes, there's a risk of bugs, Paul. You're absolutely right. Whenever you touch code, there's a risk of bugs. But,
right.
The overall, I mean, really, it'd be really almost the same process, though. We've gone through and iteratively debugged, tested, et cetera, et cetera. It's just using Rust instead of C++ as the base. And long term, I think it'd be worth it. I've written code that I had mallocs and I had frees, but I put logic that branched around the free. That's a bad thing. Or you use string operations that are not safe. Well, Rust doesn't have any of that. I mean, maybe we could focus on what we want the application to do and not on how to not do any stupid user tricks. I don't know.
I think the variables, if you will, forgive the pun, are really in things like Sherry, which we've talked about on the show, which has been talked about more as the popular press talks more about memory safety, right? And again, we've talked about Sherry on the show, and I think it's great. You couple that with Sergey Bradis in really truly understanding your inputs and outputs in software, right? And then maybe rewriting or choosing a language that wipes out some of the memory bugs. I think we get to a place where we have much more resilient software, right? And it remains to be seen how resilient that software is. But I think we're very much evolved and on the evolution of creating much more resilient software. Now, adoption is the other thing, right? We're seeing largely open source projects and ones that are critical to our infrastructure atop this. What about all the other infrastructure, all the other software that's out there, right? They're maybe more profit driven, they're not going, man, we're not going to give a whole lot of resources to rewriting our software because it doesn't make us money, right? So there's that.
So I'm actually thinking, it's interesting project Google's behind this particular article because, where Google's made a lot of progress in Rust is actually redoing huge chunks of Android into Rust. And talk about a high visibility place to make a mistake. Holy crap. That's an eat your own dog food, right?
Android is an amazing. The more I dig into Android, the more I'm amazed as to the architecture, infrastructure that revolves around Android. That's very much rooted in the Linux kernel. I implore our audience to go listen to. I don't know where I referenced that. In which podcast? It might have been my Eclipsium one, right? But there's a guy named Greg. And Greg is one of the Linux security maintainers, right? And he talks about how they are protecting the Linux kernel, and it's amazing. And look, the Linux kernel is just one project that we have, but it is the shining example. But it's also the exception to the rule, right? Because Greg, it's a great interview. Go listen to Open Source Security Podcast with Kurt and Josh. I love those guys. They do a great job. And Greg came on the show, and the three of them talking, I'm like, everyone who has any kind of investment in open source software security should listen to this show, because Greg is the person that is triaging Linux kernel security vulnerabilities. Now, translating this to commercial software is it's apples oranges, right? Because Greg's look, you can use the Linux kernel or you can not use the Linux kernel. It doesn't matter to me. Don't use it. That's fine. If you don't like what we're doing, don't use it. But that also is like the kind of philosophy behind the openness of it, that like they're incentivized to make software that is good and resilient. So like I guess what it comes down to is I trust Greg, right? And we'll talk about this. So we're going to interview Omkar from the, I believe he's from the Open Source Security, Open SSF, Open Source Security Foundation. Mm-hmm. And when he and I were talking, we kind of both agreed, like, yeah, we trust Greg, right? And it's weird, like I'm okay with I trust Linux because I trust Greg, right? In this particular model. This does not translate to many other different types of software. Now it translates to a lot of other open source, like curl, I trust Daniel. Like everything I've observed and heard Daniel speak about, and like I trust Daniel with curl. But how do we extrapolate that trust to everyone who creates software? And I think that's where we come down to, do we write it in Rust? Do we write it in the more memory-safe language, right? Because we don't trust the developers as much, we got to trust the architecture, the underlying technology, Rust or C, in this particular case. I love this. I love this. I love hearing from the open source, because like I love open source, and I'm like, if it comes down to I trust Greg, I'm cool. I'm cool. But go check out that that interview on the Open Source Security Podcast. It's very much what we're talking about today. Where do you want to go from here? Speaking of, if we segue off of speaking of trust, we got a very low trust.
Well, what shall we hit on VMware for a minute?
Oh, you mean speaking of low trust, should we hit on VMware? I think is what you meant, Lee.
Yeah. Well, the sandbox escape that they're so bad they backported the ports to some unsupported versions of VMware. So, I mean, how long we've tried to find sandbox escapes before we found them in VMware, and now they're like easily out there, for crying out loud. That's not cool.
I remember a time, Lee, when I was very concerned about this VM escapes, and Ed Scotus and company took that on basically and talked about VM escapes. And after they talked, I felt better that they were looking at it, but I also kind of felt like skeptical that this could go on for a long time. Like we could have VM escapes. And then like Docker introduced containerization, and I was like, this is not a secure sandbox. This is just a containerization. And then Kubernetes came along, and I'm like, well, they just threw security like out the window entirely. And so I don't trust any kind of sandboxing technology, to be quite honest, right? It's kind of the history behind it all.
Mm-hmm. So I'm more concerned, that I am a little bit worried about sandboxing when it comes to VMware, but I'm more concerned that it's stable and running and that somebody can't easily hack in. And that's where I'm reacting to these, is like, okay, I'm going to update my stuff just because I don't want I don't want the bar too low. There's no such thing as perfect, right? But,
I think a lot of people are moving away from VMware anyway because of the purchase by Broadcom and the price changes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah. What was the thing was it ESXi free that they rolled back kind of thing?
Yep, and they changed the price. So it's going to cost a lot more. So people are moving.
I was going to say, when you get acquired by someone like Broadcom, right? Like changing the price means it's not less expensive; it's more expensive.
In principle, it could go either way. But what I'm reading is people are moving to open source solutions, primarily Zen.
Mm. It's interesting. There's been this ethos that like friends don't let friends run VirtualBox or Zen or these other technologies, but we're pushing that envelope now. where we have to rely on some of the more open source things because
Yeah.
the commercial options aren't where it's at today.
Are there Zen escapes too?
Oh, I'm sure there are. I don't know that it's necessarily security driven, Sam, to your point.
Yeah, I haven't heard of it.
It could be commercialization driven, right?
I don't know. I think Zen has most of the market. There's certainly incentive to escape from it.
Oh.
It makes me want to reevaluate my virtualization environment, right? Like but it's also like you pick your poison, right? Like there's security and there's operations, there's compatibility, right? Features, like there's a lot that goes into that other than security, which I think as security practitioners, we want to like sweep under the rug, but like there's business requirements. Like we can't lose sight of business requirements, right?
No,
but business requirements are going to trump security pretty much every time, right?
Right.
Well, they have. The advantage of virtualization and containerization is so large that it's worth suffering some security vulnerabilities to get that much improvement in the efficiency of your servers.
Containerization, though, like a lot of the security is on you, and some of it is unavoidable.
Yeah, one problem I find, my clients are finding, is when they deploy something in a container with the correct version of everything, then it works, but then it's very hard to get it updated. So you end up running old vulnerable versions of stuff.
Just so it works.
Yeah, well, because the container comes all put together by somebody else, and you can't really tinker with it. You have to wait for the developer to improve it.
Right. But this is the whole, it's one of my stories, and I relate it to coffee. Which story is that? Now my system is acting up. All right. So, no.
Number 5.
Is it my story number 5 where I relate to coffee? Oh, purism. Yeah. So this is my coffee analogy. I don't know if you see my presentation when I talk about the coffee analogy in relation to the supply chain, right? So at the very, I trust the supply chain right end of the spectrum, let's say. When it comes to coffee, I go into a convenience store and I open up the can. Most people listening to this show, on the show, we've been in a convenience store, right? And you're like, I'm thirsty and I want a caffeinated beverage. You're going to go to the case, you're going to open up the case, and you're going to pick up a caffeinated beverage, coffee, whatever, your Frappuccino thing from Starbucks, but it's prepackaged in a sealed container, and that's what I'm going to consume as coffee. And I'm going to trust that the supply chain that contributed to the manufacturing of this coffee was sound. Now, if you're highly skeptical, paranoid security person, or you're a coffee zealot, as it were, you're gonna go, wait, I don't trust any of that process. So the other end of that spectrum is I'm gonna grow my own coffee plant, right? I'm gonna grow my own coffee beans. I'm gonna harvest my own coffee beans. I'm gonna roast my own coffee beans and put it in probably this device that has no electronics that brews my coffee, right? There's a lot of different options there. French press is a classic example, but there's lots of different things. My family is even though my last name doesn't indicate it, my family is very much Italian, right? There's the things you put on the stove that you put the grounds in, and it percolates the coffee, and you put it on the stove. There's no electronics involved, right? Like you're brewing your own coffee. So that's one end of the spectrum in terms of coffee. And I think that in the supply chain, we have very similar analogies. Are you taking it off the shelf, right? Are you taking a container or an application just off the shelf and trusting that the supply chain was sound, that there was no tainting of the coffee beans, that they were all put together from organic sources, or the opposite end of the spectrum, I'm brewing my own coffee, I'm growing my own beans, roast my own beans, brew my own coffee, and everywhere in between, right? Maybe you go buy a can of Folgers. Maybe you go you buy your beans, but you grind your own beans and you put it through a coffee pot. Like there's a lot of different variations of that inside the spectrum of I'm growing my own coffee versus I'm going to the convenience store and I'm picking up a bottle, right? Containers are the same way. I highly recommend that folks kind of lean more towards I'm brewing my own coffee when it comes to containers, for example, right? I've talked about this in the show in years past where I don't want to take a container and then run my application in it. I want to build that container myself, right? And there's even nuances in that. Like I've built containers that are like literally from scratch, which is the equivalent of grow my own coffee kind of thing. Purism makes hardware and software, and they're very much of the I love this post for this reason, right? Because this isn't for everyone, but purism is like, look, we grow our own coffee plants. We harvest the beans, we roast our own coffee, we produce the beans, we grind our own coffee, and we make our own coffee. Like they are in complete control of that supply chain. And they have the moniker, which I love from this post. This is like the thing that really resonates with me from this post is that from a supply chain perspective, they say code is malware if you cannot verify the source. I mean, this is the extreme of supply chain security in this particular case. And I'm not saying this for everyone, right? Because some people, you may want to go in the convenience store and buy the coffee right from the convenience store in a bottle that's prepackaged. Or it could be like, I want to grow my own beans or anywhere in between. But you have to make that decision for yourself for each individual application and instance of this leave, right? Like there's different levels of this. I'm not saying it's an all or nothing for all the things you consume, but it could be for this particular function in my organization, I'm going to grow my own coffee beans. For this other aspect of my organization, I'm going to be like, I'm going to the convenience store and I'm picking up the Frappuccino prepackaged in the bottle kind of thing, or anywhere in between. And these are the decisions we have to make based on the supply chain. Does that make sense? Am I just? I feel like I'm rambling, but I feel like there's some sense in there. I'll throw it back to Sam and Lee. Am I crazy, or am I? Maybe that's the wrong question because I am crazy. But
No. I don't know. I'm thinking about it. The knowing what you're getting, that's got to be a thing. We've got to have, good intel on what the software package is. I mean, that's where this whole SBOM thing comes at.
I agree.
The problem is going to be balanced. Is the practicality of it.
But I agree, Lee. I think the convergence that it's a great point, right? It's this convergence between how close can I get to assurance of what I'm getting is actually what I'm getting, but how close is that between the growing of my own coffee versus the getting of the bottle from the thing, right? If I can get the bottle from the thing and I can perform attestations to say this is sound, like how close can I get to that level of assurance versus I grew my own coffee beans and I did the whole process myself, right? Like purism is like, I can't get there unless I control every step of the supply chain. And I get that, but that's not always practical, right? So how close can we get as organizations to, but I don't want to go through all that work. I want to know that what I get from the convenience store in a pre-bottled thing of coffee is, can I attest to that? How close can I get to if I brewed that coffee myself? That's my coffee. That's my coffee analogy. I don't know how much it holds water, but whatever.
Well, I'm actually arguing about this with one of my clients now. I mean, you often have things that you cannot secure, and you have to put a layer of security outside them, like a firewall.
Right.
And so if you ought to be able to take untrusted products and increase their trust level by adding protection layers outside that you do understand.
Right. So maybe I consume the coffee from the convenience store, but I take a whole bunch of activated charcoal to make sure that I don't get sick. Right. That's kind
essentially it.
that's kind of the analogy, right?
Well, I think this is what you end up having to do with containers. That's what happened to my
Yes.
client. They have a container, but the vendor only wants to update it every 3 months. So it's always going to have old, out-of-date software versions inside there.
Yeah, see, but in that case, I would advocate more towards the side. I was using the left side to depict this. The left side of I'm going to grow my own coffee, right? Like I am a huge proponent of building my own container environment, right? And there's different levels to that. I've pushed it so far.
But
Just as
they
an
have-
example, Sam, I've pushed it so far that my container is from scratch and I'm loading a known good root file system from that. I'm not saying that's for everyone, but that's the like extreme. I don't know why I use the left for that, but like that's my extreme left, right? The extreme right is, oh, I want to run an Apache container, so I'm going to go pull the Apache container and I'm going to run Apache, and that's my. I take my coffee from a pre-bottled thing in the convenience store.
But I think in practice, a lot of people in the situation my clients are in, where they have a big, complicated commercial product that they cannot reproduce. Either you run it in the recommended environment provided by the vendor, or you drive yourself insane trying to run it in a different environment when you don't even have the source code. I mean, there is no realistic choice.
Right. It's interesting, like, how do we validate that, right? Like, how do we, in the analogy, so this is my last year keynote at RVASec and such, like, how do we validate that? I'm like, do we get a mass spectrometer to decipher exactly what's in the coffee? But that's a cost to me, right? Like, I feel like that is a shared responsibility that should also come from the vendor, right? Like, should I have to get a mass spectrometer to go? I want to measure the coffee, like how much? So my analogy, Sam, was we're older, right? I have high blood pressure. How much caffeine is in that coffee? Like I basically have to trust that what the provider is saying is the caffeine that's in there. Even if I buy the beans that grind them myself or I buy ground coffee, I have to trust that. How much caffeine am I getting? I really don't know unless I test it myself, but that could be expensive. I think that's what you're coming down to, Sam, right? Like to validate that supply chain is expensive to the consumer. Like gear to measure the caffeine in coffee is super expensive, dude. Like super expensive.
Well, you create the business criticality of it, and then you adjust the risk to an acceptable threshold,
Right.
But anyway, this relates to my story number 9 I wanted to mention. Cloudflare has made the first LLM firewall.
Yeah, I like this story. I also don't lose sight of the fact that I want to talk about your story number 5. But let's start with your story number 6.
Yeah, well, that's all I wanted to mention. I mean, it's in an early stage now, but this is what we're going to need. Like you have web application firewalls, you're going to need LLM firewalls. And all it does now is watch for repeated requests, it has rate limiting, and watch for sensitive data going in, like credit card numbers and social security numbers and such. And that's good, but what it really needs to do is to stop prompt injection attacks. And that will take some time until there's a good library of those to recognize, just like there's a library of SQL injections and such.
I think it's interesting, Sam, that we're developing technology that sits in front of our technology for LLMs,
right?
To kind of gate the. It's like a patch. It's like it feels like a Band-Aid to me.
Well, it's just like you have a lock on your door and you have a guard on the gate. It's just defense in depth. And like I say, it addresses the issue we were discussing. If you have a vulnerability you can't patch, then you need to put security outside the device.
I think it's interesting that it extrapolates this out from the LLM. It could be a benefit of this technology, right? Because the tricky part is that your queries and your answers to those queries are part of the algorithm in the LLM. And this seems like a way to extrapolate those, separate those, right? And kind of gate those. Whereas like your data and your answers are kind of intertwined in the way a traditional LLM works.
I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, the question and the answer are separate.
But it's like embedded in the LLM, the data and the question are embedded inside the LLM. You know what I mean?
Well, if you're talking about the functionality of it being difficult to explain, that's a big issue. I mean, it has, in a sense, it has memorized all the training data, but or learned the trends present in all the training data. And your prompt, it just matches to some portion of the training data.
It still feels to me like a Band-Aid.
It is, absolutely. But I think so are firewalls. This is just every layer of security is like that.
Mm. I want to dig into your story number 5, Sam.
Yeah, well, that's Ivanti, right? And I think here we have, I kind of saw this coming when the government announced that all government networks had to turn off their Ivanti appliances by like Friday a week ago. Mm-hmm. That really attention, because that was really extreme recommendation. And I said, you can't just clean them, and apparently you can't. And apparently, even when you do a factory reset and you download the official Ivanti detection of compromise tool, it still doesn't work. You could still be compromised, and that tool will not pick it up. So now the government has gotten fed up enough. CISA has just said, do you have to keep using Ivanti? Can't you just switch to some other brand? So it seems like Ivanti has handled this security problem so badly that they've lost the confidence of the major players in the government.
You know, it's interesting. My coworkers have supported this notion. My story number 29 is an article from my coworker, Nate Warfield, who has done a couple of different research initiatives. And so this first one is basically like, with Ivanti, my story number 29 is Nate's like, look, the what does ICT stand for? Integrity checking tool.
Right.
From Ivanti, Nate proved this could be circumvented.
Yeah.
And that's the most recent resource that we have, that like basically other vulnerabilities, because there have been many, right? Put those aside for a moment. However, if attackers are being really spry, they can evade the integrity checking tool. So Nate proved that in my article that I researched, that I linked to rather in story number 29, right?
Yeah.
But also, I think CISA is interesting in recommending that these systems be restored to factory defaults. I don't disagree with that, right? Like this is a thing, and you should do that. However, Nate previously in like 2022 was like, look, if an attacker gets on these particular VPN firewall appliances, Ivanti maybe, I don't know if in the 2022 research, Ivanti was one of them. F5 was definitely one of them. But Nate was like, look, if I embed myself as an attacker in the backup, right? So you take a backup of your appliance. And then, well, hold on. Let me describe the timeline differently. You got a running appliance. An attacker compromises your appliance. The attacker then gets into the backup. You then realize that, oh my God, my appliance is compromised in some way. Then you as the IT administrator, like, oh, I'm going to rebuild from scratch, right? You rebuild from scratch. All three of us on the show right now, right? We've been in operations for a long time. We rely on the backup. We're like, all right, I'm going to rebuild, and I'm going to restore my backup of my config, of my whatever it is. Inside that backup is where the malicious scripts, I don't want to say malware, it's not necessarily malware, but the attackers have implanted malicious scripts that basically reinfect the device.
Yep.
Nate proved this in like 2022, and he was like, this is how you would do that on not just F5, but in other platforms as well. So I'm like greatly concerned. I would like, I don't want to poke, I hate like picking on vendors. This is my thing this week. I don't want to pick on vendors. We all live in glass houses, right? So I don't pick on vendors, but I want people to be like aware of the risk in this scenario. And Nate has very eloquently in multiple conference presentations gone, this is possible. Not only, so my day job aside, right? Because like obviously I'm biased because I work for Eclipsium. Nate is my coworker. I love Nate like for a lot of reasons, but like he does great work. But also like this is possible. Specific research aside, this is possible. So I don't disagree with CISA's recommendations, but I want to caution people that attackers are really being very smart about this. They know this technology. They know that you could rebuild this device and restore from backup. They're going to embed themselves in backups in multiple different ways. We've seen, particularly in the wild, Nate and I've had conversations. I'm like, Nate, is this your technique or is this an attacker's technique that's reinfecting this device? And it's kind of a crapshoot. He's like, somebody's like, no, this is their like new way. And then sometimes he's like, that's kind of like the way that I described in my conference talks, right? So like, this is very concerning to me because I want organizations to be resilient, but it's hard for them when attackers are embedding themselves in backups and persisting through rebuilds.
Yeah, we were talking about this a while ago, and I don't think we had an answer. If you can't trust your edge devices, like your router and your VPN, how do you protect it? Can you run antivirus on it? What can you do?
No, but vendors make available like integrity checking tools, and the integrity checking tools have vulnerabilities in them that attackers can get around.
You would think that Tripwire would be accurate enough. Just look for the hash of every file.
Dude, it's unbelievable, right? Like, how long have we known about Tripwire? Like Gene Kim back in the day. I think was it a paper from Gene Kim when he worked? No, I say worked, but studied under SPAF. Did Gene study under SPAF like back in the day? I think that's the history of it, right? But we're talking about 20 plus years ago.
Yeah.
Right? When Gene was like, here's how we hash every file. We're back to that 25 plus years later.
Well, and your router and your firewall ought to do that every time you boot it up. I mean, it seems like you could add an integrity checker that would prevent all this stuff, but it hasn't happened.
A sound integrity checker, right? We have a lot of conversations about this, about my day job, right? One of the conversations is, how do we know if an attacker has added a PHP backdoor to a web interface on a firewall or VPN, right? Well, we should know that. I mean, this should be, again, back to our conversation in this context, this is like 25-year-old plus technology of integrity, right?
Yeah. Well, that would involve adding an extra PHP file, and it would have standard malware signatures. I mean, an ordinary antivirus solution should be able to pick it up.
But the integrity of your firmware should change, right? Like if as an attacker, I compromise the firmware, I add a PHP file, we should go, oh, wait, like as a whole, like that file shouldn't be there. Like the integrity of the system is compromised at this point.
Yeah, that's right. And you should be able to scan your backups and pick that up.
Right. But we don't, the facilities to have this level of visibility, Sam, largely don't exist today or hard, like they're edge cases. And that shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't be the case.
They don't. Well, I think until recently, people thought hacking your router was something that wouldn't happen. Now we're having to accept it's happening all the time. So I think there's a real market for a security device to protect your edge devices.
There has been that over time, for sure. But yeah, this it's a dusty corner. This whole thing we're talking about, right, is the dusty corner that we're not paying attention to. And the reason why attackers are paying attention to it is because it's a dusty corner.
Yeah, well, we made SE Linux to address this. There ought to be some enhanced security version of an operating system that you demand on your edge devices that watches for this stuff with tripwire or something like it on there, so you know that nobody's messed with it.
It's the visibility into this space that could be there that is not. And it's why attackers are going there.
Well, somebody should just make a router that your costs more that has this extra security in it, and that would be a great benefit, I think.
But also it's, I think why attackers are gravitating towards things like bootkits, excuse me, and things like admin to kernel. And it was one of the stories that I found this week that I thought Ars Technica did a great job. My story number 4. Hackers exploited a Windows 0 day for 6 months after Microsoft knew of it. Now, look, again, I think us picking on vendors is not like in anyone's best interest, right? Like I hate like the picking on, like, oh, that vendor didn't pay attention to this, so we're going to pick on them and we're going to like shame them kind of thing. What I want to extrapolate that to is that I don't agree with their response to this particular threat, right? And I could go on record. If you go listen to all 800 and something episodes of this show, you could probably pick out, use some kind of AI analysis engine, and go, Paul largely doesn't agree with Microsoft's stance on admin to kernel vulnerabilities. And that's the crux of this. Microsoft's stance on if an attacker garners admin privileges, their then privilege escalation into kernel is not Microsoft's problem. Now, look, I empathize with Microsoft on this as well. Like on the flip side of that, like I get this whole thing, but we're at the precipice of this particular issue.
Well, Microsoft's position makes sense to me. So can you explain it to me? I mean, if you're the administrator, you can certainly escalate the system, install software, update the OS and things like that. So why is this a vulnerability? If someone that already has administrator can move up to the kernel,
I think a great like article, blog post analyzing not just Windows operating systems, but across multiple operating systems. Let's go to Linux. Let's go to BSD. Let's go to traditional Unix, and let's go to Windows, and let's analyze the escalation from administrator and or root into kernel and what protection mechanisms exist and how many folks actually implement correctly those mitigations. Go to Linux. Go to Linux. Like once you're root in Linux, my feeling is it's game over. Like, yes, there are protection mechanisms, but like largely it's game over. Same for Windows. So we're on the level playing field in operating systems, in my opinion, of admin root to kernel. Right? For good, better, and different. Like, I don't necessarily agree. Like, I think there should be protections in that. I think we should be patching things for that. But
how could there possibly be any protection? I mean, you're the administrator. You're trying to work on the machine. What, do you have to have yet another account with another password as kernel?
But I think moving forward, Sam, having said all that, I think moving forward, we do need to pay attention to this because I think that operating system protections in general have gotten good enough where attackers are going to gravitate towards this. So this is an area where we need to shore up our protections because the reason why attackers are going for kernel level, and if you extrapolate that out to now they're going towards bootloader protection, and then they're extrapolating it even further. I'm going to embed myself in UEFI. To me, those are like, we're talking about like 4 different levels of escalation. Like I'm user, and I'm going to admin or root. I'm admin or root, and I'm going to kernel. I'm kernel, and I'm going to bootloader, but bootloader still lives in EFI, the EFI partition. So, I'm going to go deeper, and I'm going to go to UEFI. To me, those are 4 different levels of privilege escalation.
But nobody put security barriers in moving past administrator. I mean, what are you going to do? Make them log in 4 times to get into the kernel?
There could be better protections. I'm not the world's best operating system architect or engineer, but I'll sit in my pulpit and say there could be better protections, Sam. Right?
Well, I'll say I like the Microsoft standard party line that once you're administrator, it's game over. So all defenses have to be preventing the escalation from standard user to administrator. That makes some sense to me. Yeah,
but I think there's lots of things we can do. I think driver whitelists are one way, right? Like, I'm admin, but I can install a vulnerable driver or exploit a vulnerable. This is the case right here that we have in my story number 4, right? They cleared the admin hurdle. They're administrator on the box. They've identified a vulnerability in an approved driver. They can install it and exploit a vulnerability to gain access to the Windows kernel. But this is I bring my own driver to the system. I'm an administrator. I got to escalate to get into kernel. Therefore, I'm going to bring a vulnerable driver. Because I'm an administrator, I can install said driver, and then I can exploit said driver. However, that's kind of noisy, right? It requires I access the file system. That's a big delineation, memory versus file system, right? So this is the bring your own driver. They explain this very nicely in the article, I thought. Like they say. They cleared the admin hurdle, identified a vulnerability in an approved driver. They can install it and exploit the vulnerability to gain access to the Windows kernel. This technique, bring your own vulnerable driver, comes at a cost. It provides an ample opportunity for defenders to detect an attack in progress. I think largely, my assessment, those can correct me if I'm wrong, access to file system. I'm not completely in memory at this point, right? So, but I think this attack they're talking about in the Ars Technica article is devastating because they say, Avast was the one that found this one. And Avast says, if an attacker, despite all of these hurdles, manages to exploit a 0-day vulnerability in a built-in driver, I didn't have to bring it myself, it's there, right? They will be rewarded with a level of stealth that cannot be matched by standard BYOVD exploitation. By exploiting such a vulnerability, the attacker is in a sense living off the land, no need to bring, drop, or load custom drivers, making it possible for a kernel attack to be truly fileless. Again, this is a kernel driver provided by Microsoft, not a third party. It exists there. I found a 0-day in it. I'm exploiting it. I don't need to write to the file system. I can exploit it and gain escalated privileges.
So I'm actually had 2 thoughts along that line. One is I'm seeing more and more stories about living off the land attacks.
Yep.
It's not just and I'm thinking, are we, in fact, one of my stories is about living off the land. And my point there was, how do we detect living off the land attacks? I mean, this becomes a behavior, right? That unexpected behavior and, in the unexpected context is about it. So I guess it's behavior-based modeling. And Sam had to sign off. Thank you, Sam. It's been lovely tonight.
Hey, farewell.
Thanks, Sam.
And my second point is you're talking about vulnerabilities and it's available for N period. How many articles have we seen there's N thousand of these devices that are still vulnerable and haven't been patched after this, what we think is a crazy long period? I mean, do we have to give it to them? Make it that easy?
No, I think we can make it harder.
Yeah, I do too.
So Kevin Bowman, I think agrees with us, Lee, right? Like
Yeah, I think he does.
So he posted on Mastodon, and he was like, look, a 0-day vulnerability being exploited in Windows for 6 months in the wild by North Korea. That's the story we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
He says Microsoft didn't tell anyone and took 6 months to patch it. I haven't even harped on that issue. Like I'm basically giving Microsoft a patch, a pass, right? About like the 6 months, right?
Right.
He says
right.
Microsoft released the patch without saying what happened. They didn't mark it as a 0-day vulnerability in vulnerability management.
Whoa.
Interesting, right? Like, so this whole thing of the driver, like the admin to kernel thing that we're talking about, kind of swept under the rug by Microsoft. Again, I don't want to pick on Microsoft on this issue, on this particular thing. I don't want to say like Microsoft dropped the ball, Microsoft terrible. But I'm not saying that. I'm not saying like, you can pull that out of context out of the conversation, but like, don't do that. What I'm saying is like Microsoft made a decision. I think the underlying issue is we have to have defenses against the admin to kernel. And we also, I want to extrapolate that. We also have to have mitigations, detections for bootloader vulnerabilities, for things that go into UEFI that are on the EFI partition, right?
Correct.
Globteba is a blog post I wrote. It doesn't like persist in UEFI, but it persists in the EFI partition. And I saw a lot of like great commentary on when we rebuild Microsoft systems, are we rewriting the entire EFI partition? If we're not, we're potentially leaving malware that's infecting bootloaders and things on the EFI partition that could persist. And that's one thing. The reason why I work at Eclipseum today, right, and the thing that scares me the most is malware that embeds itself in UEFI. And it's able to get around. It doesn't matter what you do. You can wipe the entire disk, EFI partition included, and lo and behold, infect the operating system before it even loads, before the bootloader even, which is, my example of that is Moonbounce. Swift on security, I don't know, was it you? No, it was one of my coworkers pointed out that Swift on security was asking a question like, how does malware persist if it's embedding in UEFI? And I was like, can it get around the, was it autopilot? Is it autopilotly that rebuilds Windows systems? And I'm like, if it doesn't, there's two scenarios here, right? Like if it's rebuilding the EFI partition, yes, things like Black Lotus, things like Globteba would be wiped out. But things like Moonbounce, that is infecting before the bootloader loads, dude, par for the course, right? Like, it's getting around that. And I'm like, that's what concerns me. And a lot of this malware, Lee, right? You know, higher. They're disabling Windows. The goal of this malware is to infect Windows and disable Windows protections.
Right.
Driver signing, all kinds of different things.
So think about this. Now think about the used or recycled computer. I mean, we used to just worry about whether they'd wipe the hard drive, right?
Right.
Now you get, and the consumers of those things are folks that are either on a thin budget or maybe a school or something. They're buying them by the pound. Imagine if they were all jacked up UEFI going into a school or other organization. That's rather disturbing, don't you think?
Dude, it's crazy. Right. Like the malware lives on the system.
I got a hint of what you're talking about, of adding some cautions. I was working on, I haven't done Debian a lot, and I was working on one, and it was being real stubborn because of some packages that had to be removed. And for certain actions, it says, you really shouldn't do this. It'll break the system if you do it. And that's the kind of thing we need, is that extra control. I mean, obviously I was able to go past that. There's a mechanism, but it's a slightly different path you have to take. You have to regroup. And yeah, the hackers will catch on to it. But any little bit you can raise the bar,
Right.
just make it a little bit harder, just to slow them down, so maybe you can catch them.
The scary thing for me, though, Lee, is like if malware has embedded itself in UEFI, you could even apply the UEFI update my BIOS. That comes down
And it's still there.
It's still there because the update is like a differential update. It's just like, oh, I'm not rewriting the entire SPY flash, right? Like your malware is embedded somewhere in the SPY flash, but the update is like, oh, I'm just going to update this portion and this portion. It doesn't wipe out the malware. The way to update the malware is to rewrite the entire SPY flash. Like this is something I talked about.
Could somebody write a utility that basically flashes the entire SPY flash and then puts the genuine
right, but
firmware back in?
But you're on the right path, Lee. But the trick is, I got to know what needs to be written to the entire SPY flash and what manufacturers are pushing out when you push a UEFI update. It's just the update. It's a portion. It's a
right.
I forget what they call it. It's a blob. It's just a port. It's not the full. It doesn't contain the information for the entire SPY flash. It's just the update. And so if I am an attacker, I'm in the UEFI, you could conceivably apply the update, but I'm still in that SPY flash,
right?
Which is just amazing to me. Again, all the reasons why I'm like, I love working at Eclipsium. The reason I want to do this as my job is because these are issues that need to be brought to light.
You'd have to have a way to capture things that are the user settable settings that are in there along with the firmware and what the manufacturer put in there. Is it
right?
Probably
higher end servers. It's interesting. I don't know if you've seen higher end servers have like multiple SPY flashes and also provide you like the full restore of those SPY flashes. I talked about that actually last year in my ShmooCon presentation, right? Like situations do exist where you can get that kind of thing. So,
oh man, we could spend all night on this.
Yeah, dude.
We should talk about did you catch that American Express got exposed?
I did. I saw that. Being an American Express customer, I was like, well, that's concerning.
My wife had some spicy language this afternoon. Even though we don't use that card very much, it's still, we're like, oh crap, well, good thing we got some credit monitoring so we can keep an eye out. But still,
it's a thing that hits most of us, right? My wife was like, my credit card was involved in fraud, and I heard her this morning yelling at her credit card company, right? Because we got credit cards that like one's mine, one's hers, one's kind of shared. This one was kind of hers. She was not happy about it. She was like, you need to make these fraudulent charges go away, like now, kind of thing.
So
I like to think like you're talking with Jeff, right? Like PCI is in the whole credit card fraud thing is like mitigated some of that risk, but it's better. It's still dicey, right? Like I was thinking today, it's funny you say that. I was thinking today, like, my wife is battling with this issue. Like, how much does the credit card provider like really care about this, right?
So that's a couple of weeks ago. My wife had bogus charges on her card, and she called the credit card, got everything reversed, got the card canceled, got a new one on the way.
Yep. My wife did the same thing recently too. It's funny, yeah.
Yeah, and I made the horrible mistake. I started running through what could it be, blah blah blah. The troubleshooting.
Yeah,
side
me too.
of
That's where I was going. I'm like, what did you do that you got compromised? Yeah.
It was not troubleshooting. I was supposed to be the supportive husband, and I blew it.
Right.
Totally blew it.
I was like, babe, what'd you do? Like, what transaction led to this, right? Yeah.
No, don't go there.
Don't go there. It doesn't earn you brownie points, dude. Yeah, I know we're in the same boat, dude.
I went there. That was bad. nuke the bastards from orbit would have been a more appropriate
Right.
position to take. Suffice to say that then this American Express card just a few weeks later, I was more supportive.
Yes. Lee, I wanted to ask you, I know you work in more, I don't want to give too much away, right, but more secured facilities, right? My story number 23 was interesting to me. When the Flipper Zero started to get really popular, I started asking my friends about MouseJacking.
Yeah.
And they were like, Paul, this is like circa 2016, 2018 style attack. I want to say 2016, right? When Bastille first disclosed this attack. And I'm like, but there's a renewed interest in MouseJacking because of the Flipper Zero. And many of our friends, Lee, were like, oh, it's just script kiddies, blah, 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 blah. But I'm like, no, but hold on. This attack might be 8 years old, right? But that doesn't mean, so 8 years go by, someone is running this vulnerable hardware. And I'm like, this is valid on a pen test. And I love my story number 23 because it's exactly this, Lee. They're like, look, we're doing a local penetration testing exercise, and you could use a number of different hardware to accomplish this. Like, for those out there, I get it. You could use a lot of different hardware. You can use devices that are actual mouse or keyboard dongles to do this, or you could use a Flipper Zero with an NRF 24 device. Exactly what they used in this article, rather.
Right.
So they were in the facility, and they were like, look, our client, they own this entire building. So we know, scope-wise, you understand the scope-wise, if I'm penetration testing for a client and they're in a building and it's shared by multiple organizations, if I'm enumerating all of these different keyboard and or mouse dongles, I could be exploiting a different company. And they're like, that doesn't apply. They were like, my client owns the building. So any mouse or keyboard that I observe in the RF spectrum is part of the company, right? I'm like, cool. And then they're like, look, I put this add-on to my Flipper Zero, and I listened for any of these devices that might be susceptible to an 8-year-old attack on MouseJacking.
Yep.
And they're like, you know what? We found one. And what we did was, when we found a vulnerable MouseJacking attack, we injected a Ducky script. The Ducky script got copied to the Windows system. That Windows system made a callback to our interpreter script, and we own that complete Windows system. I'm like, this is great. This is great.
That's cool.
That's great. I'm like, this is a practical usage. Now, look, you don't need a Flipper Zero to do this attack. Certainly not. But you can. And it has certain luxuries associated with that, and they did. Now, my
yeah. Well, you mentioned secure facilities. When I first started in the late '80s, the big concern was emissions. That somebody could sit outside and capture screens and other things, images, right? And so transmission out was a concern. Now we have the wireless keyboards, Bluetooth, whatever. You have not only the outbound signal, but you could also intercept the inbound. And it's a different. There are a lot of areas you're unwired, but the thing about the 8-year-old vulnerabilities, we replace the CPU regularly. How old are the monitors and the wireless keyboards? I mean, some of those things hang on 10, 15 years because they still freaking work.
Oh, Lee, you're hopping on exactly what I'm jiving at in the story, right? Like, the remediation is Bastille Linux. Again, it could be 8 years old, fine, but they have a list of vulnerable devices. Yeah. Like, before you do your pen test, go through this list of what's vulnerable to this attack. Do I have it in my environment? If I have it in my environment, apply a firmware update. If the firmware update doesn't fix it or it's not valid, replace that device, especially in secure facilities, because folks can do this particular attack, right? They had a range of 100 meters. I pointed out that by default, a Flipper Zero does not have this capability. It's through an add-on board in NRF 24, right? And I linked to Rabbit Labs is the one that I have for my Flipper Zero.
Right.
That I've tested this on.
Yeah.
Rabbit Lab is, I think his name's Ryan. But I linked to his mini board. He's got a couple of different versions of it, right?
Right.
Do this test in your facility, right? If you have these devices, replace them or update the firmware on them. Get them out of service. Bluetooth ones aren't necessarily vulnerable. Some may be, right? But like these other ones that are using the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum, independent of Bluetooth, they're just using the 2.4 gigahertz spectrum, are susceptible to attack. And update the firmware or replace them in your environment, because it's still a valid attack today. So many folks I talk to are like, oh, that's an old kind of thing. I'm like, yeah, it is, but like, how often are you cycling out your mice or keyboards that are using these particular dongles? Like, this needs to be like an operational thing. We've dismissed it as, oh, like, no one will be running that unless they are, in which case you need to replace that hardware.
Yeah, we should probably caution folks, though, before they go hunting for those, and make sure they have permission.
Because you can pick up on your neighbors, right? Like, again, the story was, I did a pen test for this organization. They own the whole building. It was only them in the building. Therefore, I could do this. If in today's economic times, you're in a shared today in the studio, right? We have neighbors that could have that. This attack is not, this assessment rather, is not indicative of targeting a specific, you can't like target someone. It just tells you like, oh, in the vicinity, there's this device that's vulnerable. I don't know if that's the target that I have permission to or not, or if it's someone else.
Well, you're reminding me of, I was talking to a guy who has, at his main company site, he has a wireless IDS that'll, de-auth things that aren't supposed to be there. And he owns the whole area, and he's got a buffer zone, so no problem with neighbors. And they opened a facility in a strip mall. It's offices, not stores, but whatever. It's same idea. And he was telling me about all the things he did to make sure he didn't de-auth his neighbors or otherwise impact them, because he wanted to be real careful that he didn't get voted off the island just because he was doing security within his space for his user. And I was actually really impressed, because he really thought it through. And he did a bunch of dry runs with everything just in monitor mode before he went live. For the same kind of reasons we're talking about. Because, you don't want to DOS your neighbors. You don't want to get thrown out on your butt because you did something wrong. That's not, that's not a good thing. Anyway, did you catch the one about NSO having to turn up over their source code?
No.
So, they're the ones that make the malware for taking over Androids and iOS devices. And back in 1819, the NSO group had a vulnerability. I mean, was hitting up WhatsApp. Excuse me. Their VoIP driver had a bug in it, a buffer overflow, and what they did is set up accounts and relays and other things, NSO. And they were using that to get access to devices. And while WhatsApp patched it, they went to court, and here it is 5 years later almost. They got a ruling from the judge that says they have to give them the code. They don't have to give them their customer list or other things, but we'll see what happened. But back then in 19, the WhatsApp flaw was present in iOS, Android, Windows Phone, and Tizen, Tizen devices.
Yeah,
little bit on
Tyson
the
is
obscure side.
Tyson is Samsung TVs. Yeah,
Maybe.
that's their OS. Yes, for Samsung TVs.
So I just thought it was interesting that the judge said, hey, you got to turn it over. They were trying to say, well, we're a foreign entity and we only license this to governments to use for their lawful purposes. And the judge is like, no, you guys were screwing with these guys. I said, it's been interesting watching them. What's the other name we know? NSO group, the Pegasus is the code. Pegasus. So
hey, Lee, do you have a smart doorbell on your house?
yes, I do. Although sometimes I don't think it's very smart.
Very true. So you know what's interesting, Lee? You say that. I've had the Ring doorbell on my house for a number of years, different iterations. And early on, I kind of dug into how they do security. And they very much were of the notion that, hey, we're going to push out new firmware updates, right? Like automated updates, like just, and I think since then they've been acquired by Amazon. Is that true?
I thought they were picked up by Amazon, right?
Right? Yeah, Amazon.
Yeah.
But like since then, like Ring was kind of like the first one that was like, hey, we got a doorbell, it's smart. And then every other smart device manufacturer since then is like, oh, we can do a smart doorbell. In which case you get ones from China that don't necessarily have the same security level, which is my story number 22. Which my advice, do your research before you buy a smart doorbell, right? Now, also a lot of controversy in Amazon. What do they share with law enforcement? What do they not share with law enforcement? We've seen those stories over the years, but this is the, there's a vulnerability in these Chinese-made doorbells that are basically like, I bought the equivalent of a Ring doorbell, Lee. However, the difference is because I paid like 50% less for my doorbell, that I can walk up to the doorbell and I can hold the button in for a certain amount of time and it'll pair to my app and I can take full control of your doorbell.
What could go wrong?
Like, do some research before you buy a doorbell. I've always sided with Ring. Again, you can say what you want about Ring. Early days of Ring, before they were bought by Amazon, I was like, this is a company that's paying attention to firmware security. They're pushing out updates, the whole thing. Like, I was like, this is good, but alternatives are not as secure.
The only thing I didn't like with Ring, and they changed it because they got in trouble, is that when you called support, they could log into your doorbell.
Right. Yes, there was a controversy about that.
And stuff, and I'm like, dude, no. But I think that's just because really you're hooked into their service. I mean, if now with the cloud storage for stuff, of course they can get to it. When I moved up here, I just tried to switch from Ring to Nest, which is now Google.
Right. A lot of them got bought. You're right. Ring got bought by Amazon. The other one got bought by Google. Nest, because I had the thermostats got bought by Google.
Right.
And you think like that should be a good thing. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Right.
Could be a good thing if they apply their security arm to it.
Tyler turned me on to a company called Reolink, which maintains like a certain degree of separation from the large providers because they haven't been acquired, but also with Reolink, you're kind of more in control of the cloud kind of access to it. And that's where I'm at with them. Like, I have a Reolink, and my cameras report back to a local DVR, which doesn't necessarily have cloud access. So,
right. So, I mean, that's why I say I started playing with some Google cameras. They're wireless, but they're not I don't consider them part of my security system. I use them. I want to see what's going on around the house. It's kind of fun to see where, I'm away and oh, look at that. The driveway's full of snow. I better be careful. But I'm not alerting on somebody coming up to the house with them. Although I do get alerts off them, but they're not my primary security line.
Right.
Because, you can put a jammer out there and game over, right?
I multi-layer my smart devices, right? Like I've got some, like my doorbells ring provides me some level of access that I lock down, and then I've got Reolink that also has cameras on my front porch, and Reolink makes an awesome PTZ that's affordable that I bought. So I went all in on Reolink, and that records on my front porch. And so I use both, right?
Yeah.
My neighbors kind of joke because they know I'm a nerd. And they're like, I was under your front lawn in my bathrobe and chased my young child across your front lawn. Like, don't be alarmed and please delete that footage. I'm like, you're fine. You're fine.
Yeah. My neighbor bought a set up which had like 7 cameras with a wired DVR. They're all wired. He had it professionally installed. The system is beautiful. I just don't want to spend that kind of money.
I agree.
Cheap, but
I think Reolink you could get there. Again, I consulted with Tyler. I'm like, Tyler, what do I want to buy?
Well, Tyler,
we should do like a whole like webcast or live stream on like what, as a cyber security professional, what should you use to monitor your stuff? Like, because do you want it connected to the cloud? How much cloud connectivity do you want?
And the big one is, anything inside, I worry the hell about, because that's a serious privacy risk. I won't do
So it's funny you say that, Lee. Some of my cameras that monitor inside my home don't record.
Oh, there you go.
I don't put the SD card in them. So it's only real-time monitoring. So like, I have one that if I want to monitor my dogs inside my kitchen in my home.
There you go.
It doesn't record, and you can only get that real time. So like I have 2-factor authentication. I authenticate, and I can look at my dogs. When we're on vacation, we monitor my dogs. And then my wife is like, "Oh, could we see the kids like getting snacks that they shouldn't?" I'm like, "No, like that's not what it's for. It's only for real-time monitoring."
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I'm reminded of, I don't know, 6 months ago, last summer actually, I guess, or fall. I got a few alerts in the afternoon from my backyard camera, and I looked at the video, and what was happening is my neighbors in the back were playing tennis. And they knocked the ball over the fence. And the young man, the first time he jumped the fence beautifully, right? Second time, he hopped over the fence. Third time, he climbed over the fence. Fourth time, he went around the outside and out the gate.
Right.
And I talked to his dad a few weeks later, and we had a great laugh. I promised to make sure he didn't tell his son about it, because I didn't want him to be embarrassed, because he did, it was totally cool that he was picking up his ball out of my yard. I mean, if you can't have a relationship with your neighbors where it's cool to get the ball that goes in your yard or whatever the hell, I mean, come on.
Dude, like, hold on, like soapbox for a moment, like, like be cool with your neighbors that have kids that like want to get a ball out of your yard.
Yeah.
Like, dude, like I'm totally with you on that. Like I have kids, tons of kids in our neighborhood. I'm like, if you need to get a ball out of our yard, like, go, dude, go. Like,
yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm like, we told him that actually. His sister came over a little later and had a ball in the back, and we told her, look, you're free at the gates, just go. It's cool. Right. You're our neighbor. It's like,
my neighbor's the same way. Like, I ran in front of your house in my pajamas to go get my kid. I'm like, I'm not going to go look at that footage. Like, now you told me that, like, I'm going to respect your privacy. I'm not going to go look at that footage. Like, if you need to do that, I get it. Me personally and my wife have chased our kids naked running down the street, and I don't want any of that on camera, right? Like
No.
there's being a good neighbor in this scenario, Lee, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, come on. The human part is really important.
It is. No, it is. You're right. I want to just close out on one story, Lee.
Sure.
There was a group out of Georgia Tech. Was it Georgia Tech that looked at PLC malware? Did you see the story?
Ooh.
Yeah,
Oh, no.
Georgia
What is that?
Institute of Technology published a paper on basically what they looked at was PLCs that respond to web APIs, right?
Okay.
Like, but not like what you would think. Like web APIs are how these PLCs function, and these researchers looked at how you would interact with these web APIs. Several different exploit vectors were described in the paper. More than I can mention on the show, and it requires like a lot of a further study for this particular situation. But basically, they built upon previous attacks, applied it to PLCs, and just like you have to go read this research paper. Like unbelievable research into exposed web APIs on these PLCs. They did some very, very pointed attacks against one particular PLC manufacturer, but also said it extends to Siemens, it extends to all these other manufacturers. Like great
that's
research.
awesome.
My story number 7, like it was awesome. Like I still haven't unpacked everything that's in there. Like great research paper.
Oh, hell yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I remember, with at first, with PLCs, don't even hit them with a port scanner because bad packets will just crash them 6 ways from Sunday. But now here we're taking and abusing their legitimate functions. I'm not so sure they should have a web server in it, but whatever. This is kind of neat. It'd be interesting to. Holy crap! My mind is spinning. Can you tell?
Yeah, dude.
I'm loving
So much to unpack. Like,
yeah.
we all, but the headlines were like remote Stuxnet style attack possible with web-based PLC malware. It's not FUD. Like, it's not FUD. Like, they were like, oh, we can interact with these PLCs over the web API, and we can affect change in the real world. Similar to the way Stuxnet did that. Like, it's
Right.
my whole take on this story, it's not FUD. Like, it's.
Well, it'd be interesting to see how our ICS folks would model protections for this, because they're using the Purdue model, which is a little different than other stuff we think about. But
Yeah, they recommend updating firmware on the PLCs, but also I want to advocate for the way they were interacting with the PLCs. There should be some type of authentication
yeah,
that prevents just anyone from interacting with the PLC at this level, right?
Well, this is one
I
of the
think
cases where I wanna say-
firmware updates are one thing, for sure.
Yeah.
When I read the mitigations, but also like, you got to make sure that like not just anyone can interact with this API, and that's not just firmware. That's like good architecture, good
Yeah, it is.
authentication and authorization.
it's the heck with making services available from the internet, zero trust or otherwise. This is segmentation. This is don't trust any other network. I'm sorry, that's not modern thinking, but there's sometimes
agreed.
need a hard wall.
Don't talk to my PLCs, right? From
No,
the
this
network,
is really cool stuff.
it's multi-level, right? Like segmentation for my PLCs, but also if you do get on the network, there has to be some kind of authorization scheme that prevents people from doing that.
And it turns out that the ability to monitor these networks for strange activity, even though a lot of stuff's on crazy proprietary protocols and stuff, is growing. Vendors are coming out with solutions so you can watch for anomalous behavior.
Yeah.
On your
The crazy thing is, Lee, like this is just like regular like web APIs.
Oh,
Like
I'm
it's
just
just
saying.
it was like it's just like astonishing to me that like it's a web API on the PLC.
Right.
Like that's
But that it is weird, isn't it? Oh, but I definitely think reading that paper would be a nice afternoon.
yeah. No, it's a good read.
And as I said, I've got some friends I'd love to share it with to see what they think, because it's always interesting to hear a take on something like that from somebody that lives this space. So I know just the guy.
I was kind of probing Bia on the Flipper Zero thing. Couple things on Flipper Zero. The co-founder of Flipper Zero in my story number 9 did an interview. It was interesting how he positioned the Flipper Zero as a device to test and enumerate and bring to light vulnerabilities on other people's systems. That was interesting. Also kind of hinted towards different things that are coming out on the Flipper Zero.
Now I'm wondering if he had any comments on Canada's ban.
Right.
I'm thinking that's going to unwind before long, because the locksmiths are saying baloney. Those Flipper Zeros can't open these cars.
Oh yeah.
So
dude, Hackaday did an interview or like a piece on someone who had knowledge of like cutting keys for cars and stuff like that, and debunked the whole thing about stealing cars. Yeah.
And I love the fact that he mentions that we don't discourage other people from making add-ons for the Flipper, which you've obviously talked about.
Yeah, dude, they want to create a whole. So what I loved about that article, he was like, we want to create a whole marketplace for people to create add-ons. I think that's great.
He said Arduino, but I thought a Raspberry Pi, but same thing, different day, right?
Well, that's the whole video game module.
Yeah.
Larry has one, and it's awesome.
Of course,
it's awesome, dude. It's awesome. It's really cool.
That guy has too big of a toy budget.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in upcoming episodes.
Don't worry, he'll have college students before long.
Lee, I don't know how much you've got in our closing story, like rugged gear, like Panasonic Toughbooks and things like that.
Oh, I remember those. I haven't seen them in forever. They still a thing?
Yeah, dude. Like, so many different verticals use this rugged gear, right? Like critical infrastructure, police, first responders, firefighters, right? And the security of these devices is, I think, like exemplified in this example. And so my day job, some of our researchers found vulnerabilities in secure boot in these environments. What's funny is there was I got this opportunity, Lee, this week to talk about my experiences with laptops that aren't so rugged. So at one time at DEF CON, I was checking out the hotel, had my 2008 MacBook Pro in my bag, and I dropped my bag, and it dented my MacBook Pro. Now, my MacBook Pro, back in those days, totally fine, right?
Yeah.
If that was today, may not be totally fine, right? Like,
no.
But our researcher found that there were secure boot vulnerabilities in this particular gear from GTAC. That's how I'm pronouncing it, but you can read it in my story number 28.
Yes. And
the funny part is, Lee, right?
What's this?
When I was tasked with talking about rugged gear and secure boot vulnerabilities, I was like, I remember the time I dropped my 2008 MacBook Pro, and we still have. Oh, hold on. It's right here. It's right here. I
bet it still works.
Dude, I still have my 2008.
That's awesome.
Look, it's got hack naked stickers all over it. This is my 2008 MacBook Pro, dude. I still have it. And my coworker Mickey was like, dude, you need to like throw some shit out. I'm like, I don't disagree with you. Like, I still have my 2008 MacBook Pro.
I've thrown a lot of stuff out.
Dude, oh.
That goes on the in the museum pieces there as a testament.
It was a set prop for a long time, dude. It was really funny. It was really funny.
All right. Well,
all right. Well, with that,
that's a great note to end on.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you everyone for listening and watching this edition of Paul Security Weekly. Over and out.